Great, we'll get started while we let other people join. Hello everyone, my name is Naomi and I'm a PhD student at the Cambridge Institute of Music Therapy Research. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today for our talk with Gemma Kelly, hosted by the Cambridge Institute for Music Therapy Research. I'm just going to quickly introduce to you some of the Zoom features. First, only the speakers can share their audio and video. Attendees, please use the chat to introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from. You can also use the Q&A function to ask any questions and to upvote other attendees' questions. Some will be answered live in the Q&A function, and some questions will be put to the speakers to answer at the end of the presentation. If you're using social media, please use the hashtag #SimpterWebinar and follow us on Twitter at @Simpter_ARU. After the webinar, we will also link you to our survey. Please do fill this in to help us inform our future events. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan Poole, who is chairing our lecture today.
Thank you, Naomi. And welcome everybody. This is this very exciting opportunity to hear from one of my colleagues, Gemma Kelly. But before I introduce you to Gemma, I'm just going to just mention that this is part of a webinar series, as you're probably aware. And this lead up to Christmas, we have the sort of theme of this webinar series for Simpter is about children and families. So we're focusing on that sort of end of the age spectrum, really. Please do use the question and answer function to ask your questions, and use the chat obviously to chat and say hi to each other. Some of you may not have seen each other for a while. You might see some familiar names in the participant group there. So Gemma is a physiotherapist at the Children's Trust, and also part of the research team as well. And Gemma's going to tell us about rhythmic auditory stimulation and gait training, and describe a project that we did a little while back, which was a pilot project to look at the use of rhythmic auditory stimulation with children and young people with acquired brain injury. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Gemma, and I'll come back for questions at the end.
Okay, I'm just gonna get, is that up all right? Can you see that? Yeah, perfect. Oh, hi, so thanks for the introduction. Yeah, as Jonathan says, I work at the Children's Trust with Jonathan, and the Children's Trust, for those of you that don't know it, is a children's charity that has a rehab centre for children who've had severe brain injuries, and we also offer a community centre for children who are in the community with brain injuries, as well as residential and educational care for children with severe and complex neurodisabilities. And we're focusing on our the study we carried out was with our inpatient setting, so in our residential setting for children with severe acquired brain injury. So the outline of this presentation is, first of all, we want to talk about what RAS is, and I'm going to refer to it as RAS rather than rhythmic auditory stimulation throughout the presentation. So in order to really understand properly what rhythmic auditory stimulation is, I'm going to give you a brief overview about how we walk. So what actually walking is, what it looks like, the different phases of walking, and how your body all fits together in your walking pattern, and also how your brain controls it. So the different parts of your brain and the influence that the different parts of your brain have on walking. And then feeding into that, I'm going to talk about the principles of gait rehabilitation. So what we think about when we're teaching children, and it is the same applicable to adults or anybody, how to relearn to walk again after they've had some sort of injury. And then finally, think about how RAS could be used in the paediatric brain injuries that rehab, and also, as Jonathan says, to share a bit about the methods and the results of the pilot study we've done looking at rhythmic auditory stimulation in this population. So rhythmic auditory stimulation is the use of simple regular rhythms to support the physical control and improve walking patterns. So it's that use of music, of rhythms, of the regular beat to link into your motor pathways and really help children develop the skills they need to relearn to walk again. So as I said, we're going to think about walking and about what is actually involved in walking in the different phase. And this is a little bit harder to do online, but I'm hoping with the picture it will kind of make sense to you. So yeah, this is a very brief overview, because we can't go into the complexities of it on a Monday evening, but this will give you the idea and what we're thinking about when we're using rhythmic auditory stimulation and other gait rehab interventions. So the easiest way to think about walking and what walking is to think about one side of your body at a time. So think about one leg, one side, and we'll go through the cycle of that one limb. So stance phase is one of the phases of walking. So you've got stance phase and swing phase. Stance phase is when your foot's in contact with the ground, and swing phase is when your foot's off the ground. So we start, the first point of stance phase is known as initial contact, and that's when your heel hits the floor. So your leg is in front of you, your toes are in the air, your heel hits the floor, and your body is upright against gravity, but behind your leg. As you move through the different areas of stance phase, your weight transfers over the top of that leg till you get to that mid stance point where your body is completely upright over one of your legs. And if you just think about the amount of control and coordination and balance that requires, because you've got moving joints and you've got the other side that's swinging through, that's throwing your balance off. You've got your whole of your body weight on one small area of support. So you're just on your foot and you balance completely upright against gravity to do that. So there's so many different forces that are reacting on your body that your body has to control, and it has to keep all of your joints working in a coordinated, smooth way to keep you upright against gravity. And again, from that point, your body weight still keeps transferring forwards, so your leg ends up behind you in a position of what we call extension, but yet your trunk and your head still remain upright. Your arm swings, but your head remains still, so it can look around, see the environment, react to any dangers. You can have a conversation, and all of that's occurring at the same time. So you move through stance phase, and then you come to the end of stance phase where we get to a position called toe off, which is quite an important position in walking because that gives you the biomechanical advantage for your leg to swing through and clear the floor. And it's quite a difficult position to achieve for many of our children and young people. But from this position, your leg then enters swing phase, which is actually quite a passive phase. So I think a lot of people think that's the hardest part of walking, is to actually lift that leg up and clear it through. But actually, if in typical walking patterns, that's quite a passive phase that you've built up the tension and the torque in your muscles, and you almost get a recoil swing through with just a little effort and a lot of momentum, and your leg then swings through and clears the floor, and you land back into heel strike again. So yeah, that in a nutshell is walking. So you're thinking about your heel going down, your weight coming over your leg, you being balanced, coordinated over the top of that leg, and then your weight continuing to move forward until you free that leg to swing through again. So your brain is obviously controls everything you do, but there's lots of different centres that are involved in control of walking. So this picture quite nicely shows your cortex and then down into your cerebellum and brainstem. And as I'm sure you know, you've got all those millions and billions of neurons that are connected, that are interconnected, that talk to each other, that are changing connections all the time as we learn and we relearn to do things, and we learn how to do things in a different way. And yeah, there's many different areas that are really important during walking. So in terms of our cortex, you get this area at the back. So it's about where in the line of the line of where your ear is, at the back of your frontal lobe. which has a motor system, a representation of your body in it, that we know that is our motor cortex, that anytime we think about movement, that a message will go from there down through your brainstem, out into your spinal cord and talk to your muscles. And it's very much linked to the rest of the brain and the sensory cortex that lies behind it. But I think the next slideshow will show it just a little bit better and explain the different systems and how they work together a bit more. So you get, again, these different areas. So think about that picture of the brain, and the cortex on the outside is the bit that makes us different to animals, that bit that we're really well formed to make us thinking creatures. And is involved in anything that we have to think about. So you get, as I said before, you've got your motor cortex, which is responsible for initiating movement. Every time we think, oh, I want to go over and switch the telly on, that you get the initial movement commands from that brain. But we don't think about every movement that we do to walk to get there. So we don't then think, oh, okay, so I've got to lift my leg up, I've got to lift my toes up, step down, walk through. Once we've given our bodies that initial command, unless there's something in our environment that's particularly challenging that we have to pay attention to, everything then happens quite automatically, which is what allows us to do stuff at the same time as walking. And this again comes from different regions within your brain. So the first one that's really important with your brain is called our basal ganglia system, which lies within our midbrain here, and goes into the brainstem area here. And they're a series of nuclei that talk to each other that form our basal ganglia. And I think the easiest way to think about what the basal ganglia does is for those of you that have seen people with Parkinson's, or know people with Parkinson's and have seen how they walk, and they get kind of a short, shuffly walking pattern, and they have difficulty turning, difficulty stepping over things, difficulty initiating and stopping movements quickly. That's kind of what the basal ganglia is responsible for. So without any effort at all from us about thinking, our basal ganglia kicks in and produces this smooth, coordinated, fluid movements that allow us to move smoothly and effectively. As well, you've got the cerebellum, which is the bit at the back of your brain, which is massively important to giving us coordinated movement. And because that's responsible for, so that gets a copy of all the information that your body is sending up to your brain into your sensory cortex, and the information that's coming down from the motor cortex, and it compares the two and fine tunes it, if you like. So it sends little error messages and fine tunes the movement, so you get smooth, coordinated movement. And again, if you kind of want examples, if you think of people when they've had one too many beers and they get that wide wobbly walking, they're all over the place, their limbs are flailing, that really uncoordinated, staggering type walking, and people who have got cerebellar damage can often present like that. And then moving further down your body again, so right out of your brain, you get what's called central pattern generators, which are in the spinal cord, and they again completely automatic, but influence your speed of walking, your rhythm of walking, and your automatic stepping, again with absolutely no cortical control at all, which is why, if anyone's seen the videos of the chickens that get their heads cut off and they still keep running, that's the central pattern generator that keeps that going, which obviously is no use at all if you've got no thought behind what you're doing and why. And then within your body, you've got lots of systems that are responsible for movement and also feeding back up to your brain and to give it that information about how you need to move. So your muscles and joints obviously are really important for actually moving you forwards and walking and stopping and all of that stuff, but they've also got proprioceptors in there. So they've got sensors in there that tell you where you are in space and where you are in relation to other body parts to keep you upright against gravity, really. Your vestibular system, which is in your inner ear, is very responsible for balance and things like that. And your ocular system, your visual system, are also massively important within the neural control of walking. So I'm aware that's a very brief, rapid overview, but hopefully that again gives you the idea of the complexity of walking, how many systems are involved in walking, and how we try and work within rehabilitation to compensate for one system that might have damage by using some of the other systems. So an analogy that we like to use quite a lot with the children and the families that we work with is rehabilitation is all about finding that best pathway. So if you think about the London Tube map, and you've got your route that you do every day, and it's smooth, it's easy, it's coordinated, it's controlled, and then all of a sudden one station's closed or one line's closed, and rehabilitation is about finding a different way to get that without using that one line. And it's about getting that journey as smooth and as quick and efficient as possible. And obviously it just depends on the amount of damage and the location of the damage as to whether how much progress that is likely to do. So paediatric brain injury and can happen for numerous different reasons, as it can in adults, and it's just really to highlight really that all these things do affect children as well. So quite a high percentage of paediatric brain injury is trauma related, unfortunately, and we have a lot of children that have been in car accidents, but also sporting accidents, falls, unfortunately assaults and things like that. And in these traumatic brain injuries, you tend to get quite widespread damage to the brain because what's known as diffuse axonal injuries, because you get that shearing impact of the brain as it moves about in the skull, as well as specific areas of damage. Stroke does happen to children as well, and again, similarly to adults, can happen anywhere within the brain, and it can be small, large, or anywhere in between really. Infection, so any of the encephalitis, meningitis-y type infections that affect the brain and obviously affect the children. Tumours can occur anywhere in the brain again, and then you get the damage from the tumour itself, damage from the surgery to remove it if necessary, and also potential damage from radiotherapy and chemotherapy as well. And finally, there's a category called hypoxic brain injuries, which is where the brain's starved of oxygen for some reason. So a child might have been very, very poorly in ITU, or ill, had an operation, and suffered a period where they were starved of oxygen, or through incidents such as near drownings or near hangings. So there's been quite a lot of research, and there's quite some good theories about the principles of motor learning, that whatever the child's damage is, that we apply in order to help motor learning. And again, it's quite useful for yourselves to think about learning a new motor skill that you've tried to learn recently. I don't know if anyone's taken up skiing or tennis or anything like that, but if you think about the principles that you need to learn to improve at those skills, then they apply to our kids or adults or anybody with a neurological damage. So the first one is repetition, and we know that the brain needs a lot of repetition in order to strengthen the pathways that it finds that are successful for movement. So repeating it is really important, and repeating it at sufficient intensity that the brain is allowed to establish those new pathways is really, really important. And then we need what's called task specificity. I can never say that word. Task specificity. So you need to be specific in what you're doing. If you're learning to hit a tennis ball, practicing hitting a hockey ball might not be very effective. But yeah, we also need variety. So your brain needs variety in order to learn. So again, thinking about the tennis ball scenario, if you're learning to hit a tennis ball, you learn to hit it with it coming at you at different speeds, at different angles. And the environment might change. It might be sunny one day, rainy the next day. And different people playing with you, talking to you, or things like that at the same time. So although you're practicing a task, you're practicing it with enough variety that your brain is in an active state of motor learning. And then you need an increasing level of challenge. So we call it the just right challenge, where you have to make the challenge hard enough that the child is challenged, that they are doing things that are hard for them to do, but not so hard that they fail. So it's that just right challenge that you need to adapt and sometimes go back down, sometimes ease off, sometimes get harder, so that you're always working the child at the level where they've got a challenge, but a challenge that is achievable for them. And finally, you need feedback to improve your motor skills. And there's these two types of feedback. There's the implicit feedback, which is the feedback that comes from yourself, that you feel you've done the movement and you get that feeling and you know you've achieved it. versus that explicit feedback where you get that feedback from someone else. And again, thinking of those different types of feedback is quite useful when we come on to think about RAS in a second. So these are some of the more typical techniques that we use in gait rehabilitation. So treadmills we use a lot to obviously get that repetition. You can change the incline and change the speed and everything like that to give the children the challenge and the variety, but to really get those reps of steps that you need to get motor learning. Overground walking is literally just practicing walking and maybe giving the kids clues, give feedback, changing the environment, but again, practicing, giving them as much reps of practicing of steps in different environments and things like that you can. Sometimes we need to do specific balance training, because as you saw, to walk, actually your body has to balance in quite a difficult scenario. So specifically training the balance system can help some children with their walking. Strength training, again, you've got to have strength in your muscles to be upright. You're right upright against gravity, and whilst your other limbs moving, whilst your arms are moving. So you've got to be strong enough to be able to do that. Task training, so practicing the specific parts of walking and tasks that you need to do, walking to stairs, walking up curbs, negotiating things, and finally rhythmic auditory stimulation. So RAS has been shown in lots of populations to improve walking speed and quality. And walking speed is important. It's really important to be functional. So for our children, they've got to be able to keep up, or they haven't got to, but it makes life easier if they can keep up with peers around their classroom and in the community. If you think about it, you've got to be able to walk at a certain speed to be able to cross a road in a pedestrian crossing. So in order for walking to be functional, you've got to be able to do it at a certain speed. And then walking quality, again, is important. So we're thinking about how close they are to that typical walking pattern that we saw at the beginning. And your walking quality, the better the walking, the less energy the child is expending to walk. So again, the more functional that makes it. So rhythmic auditory stimulation, as we said, uses simple regular rhythms to provide auditory cues. And this works because we know how well that the auditory system and the motor system are linked together. We know that if you hear music, you're often very encouraged to move. So you might click your fingers, you might move your feet, and we're using those principles with walking and in a rehabilitation process. So thinking about what it actually does. So the auditory cueing stimulates the subcortical motor pathways. So when we think about that picture, the ones from the basal ganglia, cerebellum and downwards, those subcortical motor pathways. And it's a process called rhythmic entrainment. And it recruits your muscles, it gets them ready, it makes your movement smoother and more coordinated and more controlled. Again, which is what we discussed earlier with those subcortical motor pathways that are all about getting that smooth, coordinated control of movement. So there is a very good evidence base for its use in adults. So a lot of the research originated in Parkinson's disease, and there's good evidence that it improves walking speed and step length and symmetry in adults with Parkinson's disease, and also very strong evidence that adults with strokes benefit from its use as well. There's a lot lower quality, but there is some emerging evidence for its use of children, for its use in children with cerebral palsy. But there's no studies investigating its use in children with acquired brain injuries yet. Hopefully ours will be published soon and there will be one. But and we think it is important that we specifically look at this group of children because they are on a different trajectory of change to children with cerebral palsy who have been born with their brain injury or had it pre-birth or had it immediately after birth. But also they have had their brain injuries in an immature brain, so they are also different to adults who have had an acquired brain injury. So this is the study that myself and Jonathan and two of our colleagues who are physios who worked with us at the time, Dr. Jill Rodder and Colin Hamilton, completed a few years ago now. And we set out to do this pilot study looking at the use of RAS with children with ABI. And prior to doing it, we'd had a lot of clinical success with a lot of different children for its use. And so we did developed the hypothesis that we thought adding RAS to standard physiotherapy would improve the walking speed and quality and gait pattern of children with brain injuries. And we set out to use a single case design methodology to give some preliminary data to either prove or disprove our hypothesis, but also to give lots more information to inform future and larger research projects in this area. So I'm just going to talk to you quickly about single case experimental design methodology, because it's not something that I was massively familiar with before we set out on this study. And so I'm kind of thinking maybe some of you is not massively familiar to you either. And it is kind of really developing as a rigorous method of experimental research, especially in fields like rehabilitation, where there's so many confounding factors and so many people don't meet inclusion criteria, and sometimes the studies are very far removed away from clinical practice. So it's really gaining kind of popularity really and rigor, and so it is things that are worth, it is a methodology that's worth considering. And so it is a quantitative methodology. It is an experimental methodology that sets out to either prove or disprove a hypothesis. But instead of comparing two groups together, you're comparing each individual against themselves. So you look at their performance in a normal circumstances compared to their performance in an experimental circumstances, but then still applying all the principles that you would do in group-based design. So trying to minimize bias, trying to minimize confounding variables, all of those things that make quantitative research rigorous. And as I said, it is still overlooked in favour of group-based designs, but if conducted properly, it can be very rigorous and gives you those real kind of proper clinical results that are really meaningful for clinical practice. So this is what our study looked like. So we used non-concurrent multiple baseline sorry, there's writing over the top of it in mine, and I wanted to read that out to sound really clever, but it's failing a little bit now. But basically what that top line means is that we use non-concurrent multiple baselines. So we use different children, we started them at different times, and we had varying lengths of baseline across subjects, so across the different children. And A/B design means that they all had their A phase, which was their normal treatment phase, followed by their B phase, which was where we changed it up to include the RAS. So the baseline phase, which lasted at least 3 weeks, and so 6 sessions, they continued just with their normal rehabilitation program. So these kids were in a residential rehab setting. They were there for intensive rehab, so they were typically being seen twice daily by a physio or a physio assistant, using some of the gait rehab things that we talked about earlier, but also doing things like horse riding, swimming, sports groups, so functional activities as well. So they weren't all specifically targeted on specific gait rehabilitation, but they were having that intensity of rehab, plus they were expected to do things outside of their sessions with their families or with care staff or in groups. During their intervention phase, so during their B phases, all we did was switch out 2 of their typical physio sessions for rhythmic auditory stimulation. So one of our amazing music therapists at the Trust joined their physiotherapist in their physiotherapy session, and we followed a strict RAS protocol for 2 of their sessions of the week, and the rest of the time they carried on as normal. We did add another A phase if the child's placement was long enough, and we looked at these 2 different outcome measures because again, as we talked about earlier, it is important to look at walking speed and kind of the quality biomechanics of their walking. So the 10-meter walk test is literally a walking speed test, and says what it is on the tin really. You get the child to walk 10 meters and you record how fast they walk in the middle 6 meters of that 10 meters. The Edinburgh Visual Gait Scale is a video-based measure, so we videoed the child walking their 10 meters, and then you score every different joint of their body at different phases in the walking to give you a score that indicates how far away they were from that typical walking pattern. And we had to go to ethics, where obviously as we're doing experiments on children, but ethics was, they approved it quite easily, really, I think, because there's a lot of evidence for the use of RAS, and we'd already been using it successfully clinically. So over the study time, we recruited 4 children who were aged between 10 to 12 years at the time, and were on average 12.5 weeks after their brain injury. So all of these kids were back on their feet. They just started walking, but their walking was maybe slow, or they were falling a lot, or it was uncoordinated, it was effortful. So they had goals around improving their walking. The children were quite different. So 2 of them had right-sided weakness, 1 had left-sided weakness, and 1 had a fall-in motor disorder. So this is the protocol that we use. That is the protocol by Thornton Rice. And we just added in our little bit at the beginning and the end where we completed the outcome measures that we needed to do. So the RAS protocol is the evidence-based protocol that you spend the first, the music tempo was the music therapist worked out the tempo that was needed from the child's walking speed in the 10-meter walk test. And then they played the guitar. So I think you saw the picture earlier of Jonathan building up a sweat, so walking backwards, playing his guitar around the children's trust. And that was, he was playing a tune that was we already knew the kids, so it was a tune that was enjoyed by the child. So they chose the music to engage the child. And it was set at the tempo to match the child's normal walking speed that we got in the 10-meter walk test. The first 5 minutes was really just about getting the child cued into that walking, and they were given prompts if needed, but for them to get them cued into that beat and stepping along with that beat. After 5 minutes, then other activities were incorporated, still at that same tempo, but the challenge slightly increased to get them moving in different ways to that tempo, so marching, stepping forward, stepping back, things like that. After that, the child was challenged by increasing their movement, by increasing the walking speed. And again, to try and get them to adapt their walking pattern to walk at these different speeds. And again, for 5 minutes, they practiced it at that speed. And then if appropriate, for another 5 minutes, you then increase their, again, thinking about principles of motor learning and repetition and increasing the challenge. We then increase the challenge further by changing up the environment. So either getting them to step over things, be outside, walking backwards, having people walking at them. So things that would challenge them whilst they were still walking at this increased walking speed. The final 5 minutes was all about withdrawing the music in the hope that they would continue to walk as they were doing whilst the music was playing. So these are the results of the 4 individual children. And so the first show the results of the 10-meter walk test. And so what you're looking at is the plots of their, so the numbers at the bottom are the session number, and then the plots are how fast they're walking. Obviously, the faster they're walking, the better. And you're looking for the trend lines, so the lines in each of the different phases, and comparing the different phases to see which one has an effect. So I think the first thing is that all the children were responding very differently throughout the study. And that's one of the, again, the real key benefits that we see from SCED research, that in group-based design, that individual differences get lost, whereas in SCED research, you can really see that different children do respond differently to different interventions. So from this, it looks like child 1 improved their walking speed more on a faster trajectory during their A phase, so the standard treatment, than they did when we added the RAS. Child 2 may be similar, but slightly less of a difference. Child 3, there was no difference really between the two phases, and same for child 4. So that's the visual analysis of the data. We then use the TAU, which is a statistical test for this type of data, to see whether what we thought visually was true. And looking at all of the children together, overall, you're looking for at what their TAU score is. So if it's between 0.0 and 0.2, then it's no real change. Between 0.2 and 0.6, it's a small change. Between 0.6 and 0.8, a moderate change, and over 0.8, a large change. So you can see here that it's overall, it was a small change that was not clinically significant. So there was no real statistical differences between normal physio and normal physio plus RAS. So this is exactly the same, but for the child's Edinburgh Visual Gait scores. So in this, the lower the score, the more their walking was like typical walking. So if you like, so you either scored 0, 1 or 2 for each joint at each different time phase, and a 2 means they were a long way from typical, and 1 less, they're like closer towards typical, and 0 within typical ranges. So child 1 had completely the opposite to what she had with the with her 10-meter walk test, in that she didn't really change in her A phase, and then with the RAS she started to get improvements. Child 2 changed in both the A and the B phase. Child 3 again changed in both phases, and potentially a bit steeper in the A phase, and child 4 had a big jump as when they started RAS, and yeah, changing within their quality, and similar trend lines between both. So to tell you, the overall was different in this one, in that there was a statistically significant effect between the A and B phase, and say it was a 0.6, so it was a large overall effect. So it was looking from this study that overall, over the period of the study, that adding the RAS potentially affected the walking quality as opposed to walking speed. However, we really wanted to look at it over the course of a long period of time to see whether the changes that the children were showing were carried on, and how they were improving. But we also did want to look at that specific change within session. So this shows you average changes for each of the children in their A and their B phase in their Edinburgh Visual Gait Scale. Oh no, sorry, and their 10-meter walk test. So again, this shows, and I hope you can see this, this shows that all the children responded differently. So for some, like child 1, they changed more with their standard physio sessions. So in those 2 standard physio sessions that we measured, the change over the course of the A phase was bigger than the 2 sessions that we did the Edinburgh that we did the RAS with, but vice versa with the Edinburgh Visual Gait Scale, they changed more, so their quality of walking changed more when we added during the RAS sessions than they did during standard physio sessions. Child 2 seemed to change more in both 10-meter walk test and the Edinburgh Visual Gait Scale with the RAS than they did with standard physio. Child 3 seemed to change more in walking speed, so 10-meter walk test with the RAS, and more in walking quality with Edinburgh Visual Gait, with RAS. And child 4 seemed to have about the same change really in 10-meter walk with RAS and with standard physio, but a better change in Edinburgh Visual Gait Scale, so walking quality with the RAS than they did in the standard physio. So, I mean, the conclusions that we've drawn from the study are that we know it's a pilot study, that was the intention, that we were getting this pilot, that this early data, that we weren't going to get significant enough conclusions to make firm recommendations for practice. But what we can see is that both RAS and standard physio improve children's gait speed and gait biomechanics, which is quite good really, that rehabilitation is changing it. That in our study, it appeared that RAS had a greater effect on the biomechanics of walking than this walking speed, which is different to other populations, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. And within sessions, overall, again, it was different from child to child, but children appeared to make more changes with RAS than standard physio in both walking speed and biomechanics. But as I said before, the really nice thing was that we saw that different children responded differently, and this is where it would be great if you could get a much bigger SCED based study, and you can really start to then pick out the children that changed more with RAS, and then start to look for some similarities between them. And what we also know from doing it is that the children enjoyed it, and it can be quite challenging for children to continue to be motivated for the entire, we're thinking about placements that are potentially 8 weeks, 3 months long, with them being challenged continually, and it can be quite hard to keep their motivation and engagement up, and the use of music really did help, and the use of RAS, I don't think we lost any of the children from engagement in those sessions. So why did our study why do our results differ from some of the other populations? And again, we don't know. We're questioning it. We got some ideas that we would love to do some future research on. And it could be that children with newly acquired brain injury do respond differently to RAS than other populations. But there is some methodological challenges with our study in that RAS always occurred after standard physio. So the children had just started walking and they always had their standard physio block first. In future studies, we would reverse that for some. We'd use what's called a reversal design and reverse that for some children. So randomise them as to whether they received the RAS first. Also, I don't know how many of you have tried videotaping children, but they always try and show off when you get the video recorded, video on them. So how accurate our actual outcome measures is, I think in future, we'd obviously have to let them know we were recording them, but we might not make it so obvious about when we were actually recording them. And then there's a lot of talk around, which I'm falling off here, but the dosage. So obviously the dosage of RAS was very low compared to standard physio, which we did choose that intentionally because we wanted the study to replicate what would be potentially possible in clinical practice. So we did think about that, but in terms of looking at the actual efficacy of RAS, we would like to do research in the future where we looked at much higher doses that would give us a better understanding of RAS versus other interventions. So implications for practice is that it definitely is one of the tools in the box that could be offered to children. And it would be great if you had the resources. It is a really nice thing to be able to offer them, especially if the child really, really enjoys music, and there's a different way of challenging them, of getting the reps and movements and things that you need, because many children do find it enjoyable and motivating. We think it may be particularly beneficial for those children that have receptive language difficulties, so those that struggle to understand what you say to them for whatever reason, be it that they have problems with receptive language or their processing is slow or their attention to language is slow. So those children that you struggle to give feedback to in other ways, having the music help you cue them in and challenge them via that way may be very useful. But yeah, different children respond differently, but by using the principles of motor learning, you do get changes in their walking. So it might end up coming back to child preference and what they would like to do. So I think we've touched on some of this on the way through, but future research, again, varying whether children starts with A or B phase, where using higher intensity and dosage of RAS, using larger numbers, and I think we would like to keep with the SCED format, because again, as we said, children with brain injuries are so different, as are so many other populations, from each other, that if we can start to learn which children respond better, then we can really tailor our interventions much more effectively. And then finally, compare just one high dose RAS intervention to one other physio intervention, so for example, treadmill training. So that is the end. So hopefully there's enough time for a few questions. But just wanted to say thank you to the young people who participated in the study, Jonathan, and then Dr. Jill Rodder and Colin Hamilton, who were the research team for the study, and also the Private Physio Educational Foundation, who gave us a grant to support this research.
Thank you very much, Gemma. That's a great presentation. So we're going to have a look for questions. I think there's something in the chat as well. So we'll start with a question from Claire Wood. Claire Wood, also, it's worth mentioning that Claire Wood is the lead music therapist at the Children's Trust, and she was involved in collecting data for this study as well. And Claire would like to know, what level of dosage would you want to try in future if you're going to design another study, I think is what Claire's getting at.
Well, I think, Claire, in terms of like actual research, rather than what we hope would be reflected in clinical practice, I think we would like to try it all. So for, say, 1 or 2 weeks, the child has, say, 2 sessions of RAS a day, and then the next week, for example, they have 2 sessions of treadmill training a day, so that you're really just comparing one intervention to the other. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Okay. There's a question. Oh, there's a thumbs up there. So there's a question from Anna, and Anna is asking, would this only be carried out as a one-to-one session, or could it be as part of a small group?
That is a very good question. I think in terms of actually catering the tempo and things like that, that you would kind of have to do it one-to-one to cater to the child, and because all the children walk at different speeds and different times and need those different levels of challenge. And Jonathan, step in if you disagree, but I would think the actual intervention might need to be carried out one-to-one. But again, we were trying to think about whether there's more imaginative ways of carrying it out, that you weren't reliant on a music therapist attending all the time. So could you use taped music, or is there any other way around making it a little bit more resource effective than having two qualified therapists in each session, if that makes sense? But I can't see how, and again, we use groups and we use group music, so dance and things like that we use a lot with our kids, and again, hugely motivating and loads of physical benefits. But in terms of the actual RAS intervention, because it's got to be so tailored to the individual child's walking pattern, and again, some of the kids are very especially if they got one-sided weakness, their walking pattern is very uneven, and Jonathan and Claire were able to alter the beat of the music to reflect that and to try and bring the steps more even together, if that makes sense again. So so I'm not sure that the actual RAS intervention would work in a group, but definitely music therapy and physio combined in a group is amazing, and we use that quite a lot.
I would agree with you there. I think there are some practical issues, maybe not difficulties, but practical issues around the use of space and safety as well when you're doing something like that in a group, because of the amount of space you might need, and thinking about the mobility issues of each of the people involved. I think you could probably do a group if people had similar abilities and they're all fairly okay on their feet. From a safety point of view as well. Yeah. So, and I also had a question for you, Gemma. Just thinking that we don't, I think on here in this webinar, get many opportunities to speak to non-music therapists presenting, and given your experience as a physio, I'm just wondering about, and this may be useful for others here who may be thinking of using RAS, when would you think of using RAS, and are there also people for whom you would not, or children for whom would you think, oh, well, this wouldn't be a good idea to use RAS?
Well, I think it is probably always or very often worth giving it a try. Like you say, I think the children have got to be able to actually walk, and I would say the minimum of 10 meters to be able to do it. So those kids that are at the stage where they are having to think about every step, about stepping one leg through then the other, they're probably not at that level yet to use it. So I would wait and use it at a later date. In our study, we excluded children that needed physical handling because of the impact on the outcome measures, but we again have used it clinically with children that still need support to maintain their balance whilst they're walking, or they're walking in a walking frame or things like that, and it's worked very effectively. I think children with massive attention issues, it might be challenging to do the full RAS intervention, the full protocol, because attending for 25 minutes is quite a lot to expect for some of our children and young people. But again, there's no reason why you can adapt elements of it to make it effective. So yeah, I think probably I would be tempted to try it with most children who are able to walk 10 meters in some form, yeah, and had goals around improving their walking speed and their walking thing and the walking pattern and things like that as well.
Thank you. We have another question from Esther. Could RAS be useful in supporting retention of walking for a child with a degenerative condition? So I suppose this is about maintaining function as long as possible.
Yeah, I mean, again, because I think with those kids as well, you're looking at those principles of motor maintenance with for them with that. And just by, if you use an intervention like that where you're pushing them to be able to walk, potentially they'll walk for longer, or they might walk slightly faster or things like that, which challenges their physical system and their cardiovascular system, because and that's not something we've measured, and is again something that would be worth looking at in future research, is that it's difficult to challenge children, so our children or children with degenerative neurological conditions, so that challenge them to the point where their cardiovascular system is getting a challenge, so it could have impacts on that. And so again, if they enjoy music and they're enjoying it, and there is absolutely no research to support this, so it's just my gut feeling, and it's not a client group who I do work with, but I can't see why it has, with an intervention that has all of that, those principles of motor learning in it, why it wouldn't be a benefit to that population as well.
Do you think that this would still be about that they would have already developed some capacity to be able to walk some gait patterns already?
I mean, and again, I suppose it's whether you're following proper RAS or whether you're using movement to help, music to help movement. So it's what elements you're going to pick and choose out of the RAS protocol. And so, sorry, I've forgotten what your question was. I'm going off at a tangent.
Well, I was just thinking that it sort of follows on from Esther's question, really, about if it's a degenerative condition, then I suppose we might be assuming that actually the child or young person has, like in Parkinson's disease, developed some gait already.
Yeah.
So there's some automaticity already going on there, and it's about not losing that function too early. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? Can anyone, this is from an anonymous attendee, can anyone use RAS or only neurologic music therapists?
I think over to you, Jonathan.
So that's an interesting question. Well, in order to use the title of neurologic music therapist, you have to have the training and keep up your membership. But RAS is often handed over to use pre-recorded music and things like that. I've seen metronomes be used as well with war veterans, etc., who are using rhythmic auditory stimulation, and there's no music therapist involved in that. So you don't have to be an NMT, I would say, but you obviously have to be a music therapist to train as well. You need to have the neurologic music therapy qualification to call yourself that. But to use RAS, actually you can train other people to be able to use the protocol itself and to follow the protocol if they're able to do so, which is why you could create some pre-recorded music that would work for an individual if it's quite specific. But it probably needs to be under the guidance of a physiotherapist, I would think, or hopefully a music therapist who understands the RAS protocol for it to be done safely. I hope that answers your question. Catherine Field, what is the RAS protocol and where does it come from? So
the RAS protocol, if I flick back to it, was what we used minus so here it is, but minus points 1 and 0.6, because that's what we added in for us. But this was the protocol that we took out of that book, and I can send you the proper reference afterwards if that's helpful for you.
If you may have access to online, but there's a book, the Handbook of Neurologic Music Therapy, and the protocol and some more detail around it will be in that book, if you're interested to find out some more about it. Are there any other questions? Well, in which case I will hand over to Naomi for the last part of this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for such an interesting talk, Gemma. What a wonderful piece of research. Thank you for sharing that with us, and good luck with publishing it.
Thank you.
So just a reminder to everyone, after the webinar, you'll be sent a survey by email. It would be great to hear from all of you, and that feedback will help us to plan our future events. We'd be delighted to have you join us for our next webinar on the 12th of December. And Jonathan Poole will be with us again, and he will be chairing a roundtable discussing best practice recommendations for using music with children and young people with disorders of consciousness, with Anna Menon, Wendy McGee, and Valerie Pash. Sorry if I've pronounced any names wrong there. And you will be sent more information on this and the link to register from SIMPTA in the follow-up email and in a couple of weeks beforehand. We hope to see you all at our next webinar. Thank you very much for coming. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot, everyone.